Hello, everyone. I'm Gail McGovern, and I have the privilege of serving as President and CEO of the American Red Cross. I truly wish I could be spending time with all of you in person, but I'm still delighted for the opportunity to connect with you virtually and to share a great big thank you for your remarkable commitment to the Red Cross and those we serve. As we all know, this past year has been filled with so many challenges for our nation and for the world. But when I think about this difficult time, I am filled with gratitude for the extraordinary volunteers, employees, donors, and community partners who empowered the Red Cross to be able to fulfill our mission every day. The COVID-19 pandemic did not change our mission, but it certainly did force us to quickly change the way we deliver our mission. I'm proud to say that just like we've done for the past 140 years, the Red Cross rose to the challenge. When disasters like hurricanes, wildfires, and tornadoes displaced families, we quickly pivoted to having people stay in hotels so we could minimize the risk of transmitting COVID. When schools and businesses closed at the beginning of the pandemic, thousands of blood drives were canceled, and we quickly forged new partnerships with hotels, sports venues, and the like, so that we could host socially distant drives in large spaces. We also adopted strict safety protocols to protect the health of our blood donors, our volunteers, and our employees. Not only did we safely meet our nation's demand for blood, we took on a new role of collecting and distributing convalescent plasma from people who fully recovered from COVID-19. And this antibody-rich plasma was used to help patients who were battling the deadly virus. Of course, we also continued our work to provide comfort and care to the members of the U.S. military, our veterans, and their families. I'm the wife of a Vietnam vet, the daughter of a World War II vet, and the proud mom of an active duty airman. So this part of our mission has a special place in my heart. And I am so proud of how we've been able to carry out our work. Instead of working in large call centers, our dedicated Red Crossers are now handling emergency calls from their homes. And we quickly pivoted many of our support offerings for our military members and their families to virtual workshops. Like the other parts of our mission, we've adapted how we teach life-saving courses like CPR and first aid. In addition to smaller class sizes, we're delivering training online. And around the globe, we continue to help other Red Cross and Red Crescent societies with our data and technical expertise to help combat the spread of the virus. All of this life-saving work is only possible because of people like you. From the bottom of my heart, thank you for your steadfast and generous support of the Red Cross mission. Now more than ever, our nation and the world need the American Red Cross. Thank you for transforming your compassion into action to help people in need. And please enjoy this special program, and I hope to see you all again in person very soon. Thank you.
Good morning and welcome to the third annual Disaster Preparedness Summit. I'm Jessica Adams, Executive Director for the National Capital Area Chapter of Your American Red Cross. We're delighted to have expert guests joining us today to share with you their experiences, insights, and lessons learned for recovery from navigating life and work during COVID-19 and so that we can be better prepared for the next major disaster. Please be sure to visit our Red Cross exhibit located at the tab above. There you will find information on our 5 lines of service, ways to get engaged, and how to stay connected. Red Cross volunteers are also standing by to answer your questions. Please consider making a donation to support the life-saving work of our mission here in our community and in communities across the country. To make a donation, you can scan the QR code that you'll see throughout the program. You will then be directed to the event website to process your donation. If you require technical assistance at any point during this morning's program, please use the number listed on the screen below. Thank you for joining us. Now, here is Jim Schaefer, Board Chair of the National Capital Area.
Good morning. I'm Jim Schaefer, Chairman of the Board for the American Red Cross in the National Capital Area. Welcome to our third annual Disaster Preparedness Summit. At today's event, we are seeking to improve communication and increase understanding among our organizations, our communities, and as individuals about disaster preparedness. In our region, we live in a unique environment and face a variety of potential threats, both man-made and natural. Responding to a disaster can be complex. Federal, state, and local governments have intersecting roles that require integrated planning. Utility, transportation, financial services, technology, and healthcare organizations bear significant responsibilities for protecting the infrastructure we depend on. Businesses, both large and small, must prepare to continue operations and take care of their staff. And as individuals and families, we need to know what to do. 20 years ago, the events of 9/11 drove home the lesson that we all play a role in being prepared for unanticipated disasters. Now we are learning that lesson again as we deal with COVID-19 pandemic, an event of long duration that affects all aspects of our business and personal lives. We've been dealing with COVID-19 for more than a year, but its long duration has also created a situation few anticipated. Responding to wildfires, weather disasters, home fires, and other emergencies at the same time we're dealing with a pandemic. So what will the next disaster look like? It could be another pandemic, but more likely it'll be something completely different. And it could again be a long duration event. The Red Cross believes that preparedness can help us be resilient in the face of potential disasters and improve our response when they occur. Our theme for this year's event is what can we learn from COVID-19 experience to better prepare ourselves for future disasters. Today, we will hear business and government leaders explain their experiences. We hope it provokes your thinking and that you will leave today's discussion with actionable ideas for improving your preparedness. So let's get started. I'd like to introduce Doug Van Dyke, CEO of Inquisit and chairman for today's event.
Thank you, Jim. On behalf of the American Red Cross in the National Capital Area, thank you all for joining us for our third annual Disaster Preparedness Summit. As Jim said, my name is Doug Van Dyke, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Inquisit. I've been on the board of the Red Cross for 6 years now, and this is my second year hosting this event. It's amazing how much the world has changed since our last summit. Last year's summit took place on January 28th. If I remember correctly, there wasn't a single mention of the coronavirus during the event. And now, just 1 year later, our summit is all about the lessons we've learned dealing with COVID and how we can use what we've learned to prepare for and respond to upcoming disasters. Our speakers will share the lessons they've learned dealing with the pandemic every day for the last year. They'll also address other disaster risks that we face in the National Capital Region and explore the impacts that significant disasters could have. While we won't be able to cover everything in detail in one morning, we're here to stimulate your thinking, your questions, and your planning. Our goal is for everyone to leave the summit with a better understanding of the hazards we face, a better understanding of the complexities in our region, and a better understanding of how to prepare for and respond to disasters in our community, our organizations, and our households. This is an important topic as we sit in our nation's capital. Washington, D.C. and the surrounding region is under near constant threat. To add to that, the size and complexity of the D.C. region that includes multiple state and local governments, the federal government, and our national security infrastructure makes for a multi-jurisdictional coordination challenge. We received a lot of useful feedback following last year's summit. We listened to your suggestions, and we've prepared a program today with an all-star cast of leaders in the field. I had the pleasure of working with many of these experts as we planned and recorded this event. Thank you for giving us your time and expertise, and I look forward to hearing from the rest of you today. I'd like to thank the members of the planning committee who organized and delivered this event. It's very generous of you to dedicate your time and resources to making this happen. It was a lot of work. We appreciate it. I'd like to thank emergency responders who keep our capital and the surrounding region safe. This includes CERT members, disaster action team members, emergency management, police and fire, and many others. We're happy you're with us today, both as participants and as speakers. You're critical to this discussion. Thank you for your service to our community. I'd also like to recognize the sponsors who have helped make this event possible, with a special call out to our presenting sponsors, Amazon Web Services and Pepco Holdings, and our session sponsor, Emergent Biosolutions. And finally, for the audience, we want your feedback. Be sure to be on the lookout for a follow-up survey, as well as resources and materials from those involved in today's program. If you have questions, comments, or would like to be a continuing part of this discussion, please notify us by chat today or send us an email at ncrevents@redcross.org. Thank you again for attending this summit. We're glad to have you here in our community.
It's my great honor to be a member of the board of the American Red Cross National Capital Area. It's a remarkable organization. I've been in awe of the Red Cross and the way it continuously and relentlessly rises to the occasion in the emergency response. Way before the pandemic struck in 2019, I witnessed its monumental effort to respond to multiple waves of disasters, from 5 hurricanes to the Las Vegas shootings to the California wildfires. The scale of the operations to deploy and redeploy and then redeploy volunteers rapidly and effectively was a staggering feat. Even beyond these large-scale operations, I had a personal experience with the Red Cross when a good friend's house burned down in the middle of a cold February night last year. Thankfully, he fled the house unharmed, but was left with absolutely nothing but the clothes on his back. Right after the firemen arrived, the Red Cross was there with blankets, water, granola bars, and a $500 gift certificate to Target so he could buy some clothes and food to tide him over. Now our friend is forever indebted to the Red Cross and raves about the organization to everyone he meets. So I couldn't be more proud to be a member of the board of this great organization. I was fortunate enough to be asked to join this board several years ago because the mission of my company, Emergent Biosolutions, is closely aligned with that of the Red Cross. The mission of Emergent is to enhance and protect lives. We manufacture a number of vaccines for COVID-19, as well as other public health threats, such as anthrax and smallpox, and Narcan, an antidote for opioid overdose. So it is our great pleasure to be a sponsor of this Disaster Preparedness Summit. And it is my personal honor to introduce our keynote speaker, backed by popular demand, Brad Kaiserman. Brad has been a vice president for disaster operations and logistics at the American Red Cross since June of 2015. Brad provides support for preparedness activities and oversees all American Red Cross domestic disaster operations, including all US territories and commonwealths. He is the guy who makes it all happen. Brad and his team are accountable for staffing, logistics, operations, and situational awareness necessary to plan, implement, and manage scalable relief operations to meet the direct needs of disaster clients and assist in their recovery. He also served in the United States Coast Guard and enlisted commissioned and civilian positions for 23 years and was a member of the Federal Senior Executive Service, holding legal and operational leadership positions at the Department of Homeland Security and the Federal Emergency Management Agency. During his nearly 30 years of public service, Brad has participated in numerous crisis operations, ranging from Exxon Valdez oil spill, maritime mass migrations from Haiti to Cuba, international drug interdiction, piracy of the US flagged vessel Maersk, Alabama, and the response to and recovery from Hurricane Sandy. So please welcome Brad Kaiserman. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Brad Kaiserman, Vice President of Disaster Operations and Logistics for the American Red Cross. And thank you so much for that kind introduction. I appreciate it. And thank you everyone for participating this morning. As we can see, once again, the pandemic has not changed our lives exactly. It's just changed the way we live them. But all of us here are fortunate to be here, to be alive, and to be well. And I think we're going to look back and we're going to realize that as we go through this morning's program and today's conference, that we were at this time at the beginning of the end of the pandemic. We've seen cases drop dramatically. We've seen deaths drop dramatically. We've seen the vaccine program just take off. And I saw last night nearly 15% of all Americans have at least one dose of vaccine, which is just fantastic. It's entirely possible that by this time next year, COVID-19 and the virus it produces will be endemic, not pandemic. It'll be part of the fabric of our lives, just as the flu viruses and just as other illnesses are. We still have a way to go. We're not there yet. And what we do as individuals and as a population over the next 4 months is likely to determine the ultimate course of this disease. It's imperative, and we tell our Red Cross volunteers all the time, that when we're in public, we wear masks, we maintain 6 feet social distance, we ensure that we don't have close contact with folks who we aren't certain are vaccinated. And we do that now to protect the people we serve and to protect our workforce and to protect our mission. I'll tell you, I don't think it's ever been more important than it is now to protect that mission. And the reason that I believe that is because I think we are also now on the cusp of a fundamental change in paradigm about the risk this country faces and about the measures that we as leaders, especially as leaders in emergency management, are going to need to take to deal with that change in paradigm. So let me submit to you a proposition. If you think of disaster like disease, and if we were medical professionals looking at this disease, what we would be seeing is more frequent large disasters. In fact, last year, there were 22 disasters in the United States where the insured loss was $1 billion or more. Let me take a moment and just share with you the magnitude of that. And I'll share my screen. So as you can see here, this map from the National Oceanographic Administration shows us the number of disasters and the location of those disasters where the insured loss was $1 billion with a B, $1 billion or more. Almost overwhelming to look at the map and the cluster, just this cluster here in the map of disasters that occurred. We set a record last year. In fact, we set several records last year. Last year was the 6th consecutive year in which the United States had 10 or more billion-dollar disasters. And last year was the single greatest number of billion-dollar disasters in the history of this country. Each year, we continue to see more and more large disasters, more hurricanes, more wildfires. And not only are we seeing more, but quite often we're seeing more intense events. In fact, last year, in the midst of the pandemic, wildfires burned up and down California, through Oregon, up into Washington state. There were several days in late 2020 where 10% of the state of Oregon, 10% of the population of an entire state was evacuated due to wildfire. In Louisiana, 5 back-to-back major hurricanes making landfall, displacing nearly 50,000 people, some of whom are still in government-provided shelters today, with Red Cross volunteers working with our partners to try to get them into affordable housing. And so if we were looking at this as a medical issue, if we were looking at disaster as disease, why we would see that our patient has a growing number of these disasters. We'd see that disaster is metastasizing. That is what we would see. And we would see not only that, but we would understand the intersection between disaster and demographics, between disaster and social vulnerability. Because even as the climate continues to change, and that we can witness the increase of both the frequency and intensity of disasters, our social environment is changing as well. Our population is growing, and it's largely growing in places where there are disasters. Population density on the coasts continues to grow at a rapid pace. And ironically, even as population is growing, affordable housing is becoming less and less available. And so when disaster strikes in any community, you have the compounding and cascading disasters of lack of affordable housing before the disaster, the presence of people experiencing homelessness or precarious before the disaster, the extent to which people are impoverished. Nearly half the country can't take a hit to their budget in an emergency of $450 without either going into debt to get that money or using a credit card they don't know how they're going to pay. Half the country. And so these conditions that our patients experiencing pre-disaster get worse. They're exacerbated by the disaster. And so I would suggest to you that if our patient had an acute disease, one that popped up every now and then, we could treat its symptoms. Maybe the patient could go to the emergency room and we could give them some meds, some pain meds, and we can get them sent home. If our patient had that kind of acute disease, our patient's condition has changed. And today, our patient, our nation, our world have a chronic disease. And that chronic disease is the ever increasing number of large, dangerous disasters, the repetitive loss and impact from those disasters. And we're no longer in a world where we can send that patient to an emergency room. We're no longer in a world where we have $3 billion disasters a year, one in February, one in August, maybe one in November, and we're through it. That was the 1980s, where we had $3 billion disasters a year. And this is the 2020s, where we had 22. Nearly tenfold increase in the course of the last 40 years. And statistically, the pattern is absolutely clear. What was once an acute problem that could be dealt with in an ad hoc way, local firefighters, local police, local EMS, former military folks, background in crisis leadership, we could respond to disasters using an ad hoc process. The level of preparation that people required wasn't particularly significant. And for most people in the country, they wouldn't necessarily feel the impact of those disasters. But again, that's fundamentally changed. And it's changed in a way, if you think back to that map we looked at earlier, that map of the $20 billion weather and climate events, where the entire center of the country, the Southeast and the Southeastern seaboard, and the entire West Coast. With $22 billion disasters last year, that's a new billion-dollar disaster on average every 2 weeks. We do not have an acute disaster problem in this country. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a chronic disaster problem. And chronic problems call for different solutions and different measures than those that are acute. And I would submit to you that the future is not one of chronic disasters. It's here. The future is now. It's already happening. We're going to see an increasing number of wildfires, as we have every single year for the past 6 years. That's going to continue. It's going to continue because of something called the wildfire paradox. And the wildfire paradox basically works like this. We've done in this country an amazing job in the last 50, 60 years at fire suppression, the way in which we deal with fires in what's called the urban wildland interface, the place where the forests and the area that's non-developed has a buffer between the urban and developed areas. Well, that buffer has grown increasingly small. And given the way that those lands have been managed, we've effectively created more opportunity for greater fires in a world that is warmer and getting drier. Perhaps you saw the report from our National Weather Service the other day that said that we're not expecting a particularly intense spring flood season, which is a great piece of news. Flooding is a devastating disaster, and it still, for now at least, remains the number one in terms of frequency and loss, the number one disaster in the United States. But the threat this spring won't be flooding. It's going to be drought, the absence of water, intense dryness, all of which will contribute to additional powerful wildfires. And we're going to see the number of weeks each year in which the West is enveloped in wildfires increase dramatically. In fact, I think I actually had that to share with you. I'll see if I can bring it up without getting too distracted. But the key here in understanding this is that we're not going to see one big wildfire every couple of years. We should expect to see them multiple wildfires each week, multiple weeks with wildfire. And what I will tell you is, as with hurricanes, the season in which these events happen is getting longer. Wildfires are now beginning in the West in June or July, not in September. Hurricane season is being moved up to begin on May 15th in recognition that cyclonic activity is happening in the Atlantic earlier than it ever has before. And so we're not just going to see events that are more frequent. We're going to see the windows for those events open wide. On the other end of the disaster, as we talked about earlier, with a growing population, especially in areas where disasters tend to occur, but with growing populations, half the country having significant financial struggles, which have just been exacerbated by a year of pandemic. We're going to see on the other end of disasters that the response and recovery phases will last longer, because it will take more time to find people affordable housing when there wasn't any to begin with. One of the things that we've observed in the Red Cross over the course of the last several years is that we've gone from an average duration of about 30 days for people in congregate sheltering after large events to as much as 120 days in a consistent way. So we've gone from a month of sheltering to, in many cases, 4 months or more of sheltering. And so that indicates to us that on the back end, we're not just going to see more intense, more frequent events. They're going to be harder to recover from, in part because the pre-existing conditions were already ripe to cause people to suffer. And we're going to see this lengthening effect in part because of repetitive loss. We're going to see the Gulf Coast, the Western states, the Southeast states, they'll just keep getting hit over and over again. Now, there is a interesting twist to all of this, especially where hurricanes are concerned. I actually don't expect to see more hurricanes. What I expect to see are more intense hurricanes. What I expect to see is a greater frequency of what's called rapid intensification. In fact, in 2020, 10 storms rapidly intensified within 24 hours to dangerous speeds. And the same thing happened in the wildfire world. Fires literally went from a brush fire to a conflagration in hours. And if you think of it, this is the pattern we've seen over and over again for the past 6 years. And it's just getting worse. Which is why I suggest to you that the problem we face is one of acute to chronic. Now, how do we address this? What have we learned from the pandemic experience that can help us address this? And I would share with you that the literature on pandemics suggests that this is not the last pandemic of the 21st century. Scientists have long held that due to just global interconnection, that we would expect to see more pandemics this century. And so learning lessons and really baking them in to how we approach our operations and how we approach our planning is absolutely vital. I would suggest to you that we literally can't afford not to learn from this pandemic. And so a couple of things that I think are critical takeaways. One, at the beginning of this, I said, COVID-19 didn't change our lives, it just changed the way we live them. And I would suggest to you that COVID-19 didn't change the mission of the American Red Cross. Our mission continues to be to prevent and alleviate human suffering in the face of emergencies by mobilizing the power of volunteers and the generosity of donors. And think about that for a second. Whatever it is you do, you're on this conference, we're here together with each other today. Whatever it is you do, I would suspect that some part of what you do is alleviating human suffering. I would suspect that all of us share a unity of mission to alleviate human suffering. You might call it to protected to serve. You might frame the words a bit differently. But in the end, we're here because we don't want people to suffer. And so as we move into a world where disaster-caused suffering is no longer acute, sporadic, occasional, but chronic, near constant, and overwhelming, our partnerships are going to be absolutely critical. In a world where there is greater demand for disaster services, longer duration for the help that's needed to respond, recover, and prepare, and limited capacity, we've got to have and sustain enduring partnerships. That's the importance of this forum. And even if we can't be in a room with each other, we can listen and we can learn and we can become better prepared to work with each other to help alleviate human suffering. I mean, you think about back to the screenshot I showed you of Louisiana and the Southeast, 5 landfalling hurricanes. That's a classic example. It took partnership between the federal government, state government agencies, the Red Cross, Catholic Charities, Salvation Army, Team Rubicon, the list goes on. Local groups, hyperlocal groups, event-based volunteers, people who aren't normally affiliated with any of the volunteer organizations active in disasters, people stand up and say, I want to help on this one. And so we've got to create the environment where people who want to help spontaneously can do that. We've got to be able to channel that humanitarian impulse to meet the needs that are going to come from a world that's moving from acute to chronic disasters. That also means that we have to anticipate disproportionate need. If you live in an area that's suffering repetitive loss and impact, we've got to make sure as responders and as humanitarians that we are aggressively targeting the services and ensuring accessibility for the most vulnerable communities. Remember, in the United States, we have an aging population. The number of people with access and functional needs is growing. When disasters strike, they tend to disproportionately impact those who were less better off beforehand. And so our ability to anticipate that disproportional need and prepare to serve it together is critical. That means knowing where vulnerable communities are, knowing who's in those communities, understanding cultural needs, recognizing differences between us, and recognizing that in a world of acute to chronic disasters, one of the things that one of the barriers we've got to break down is the fear and the divisiveness that can exist between vulnerable communities and majority populations. You don't have to look any further than the murder of George Floyd last May. You don't have to look any further than the attack on the Capitol in January to recognize that in the United States, there's increasing amount of divisiveness and disagreement. I hate to seem Pollyanna about this, but folks, we have got, as a nation and as a race of human beings, a much, much more existential threat than the irrational hatred that some folks feel for others. We've got to come together. And we were presented with opportunities in the course of the last year to change the direction from divisiveness to being together, to being unified, to showing unity of effort. And that's going to be critical for us, all of us, to be able to help those who are most vulnerable among us. A society is not really judged by how it cares for its most well-off. It's judged instead by how it cares for its least well-off, its most vulnerable. And again, in a world of acute to chronic disasters, that's just got to be a focus for our community. And last but not least, on the subject of focus, we're going to have to make some investments. We're going to have to focus. The notion of disaster seasons is, I won't even say gradually, the notion of disaster seasons is evaporating. We're not active as a disaster response organization of the Red Cross for 5 or 6 months a year, and then it's kind of slow on either side. Even multifamily fires have grown during the pandemic to really extraordinary numbers. And when you think about that, everything from home fires to hurricanes are increasing in frequency and intensity. And so we've got to be ready for that. We've got to invest in trained people, volunteers. We have to invest in technology and the infrastructure that allows us to do this. Because this may be the way we reach certain communities in the future. We've got to invest in the systems that we have that help distribute financial assistance and do casework and allow us to share the data about clients and residents who can get help from other organizations. We need to make sure that we have the necessary supplies available and distributed in our communities so that we're ready to respond to our highest probability, highest consequence disaster, which is different in every place. And as some places that are maybe used to extreme precipitation, your risk may be changing. Your risk in 10 years may be extreme drought. For those who've never experienced a hurricane before or experienced it once in a decade, these could become regular, annual, or even more than annual events. And for those who may never have experienced flooding, particularly those in the Northeast, in a repetitive way, you may see flooding become your high probability, high consequence disaster because the climate patterns around the world are changing, and that's what's changing the type of disasters that we face together. And so we've got to be able to make some investment in our trained volunteers, in our infrastructure, in the supplies that we have, and most important, in the relationships that we build to have supportive communities so that when the time comes and when disaster strikes, and as I believe it will continue to do, strike over and over again, hardly giving us time to catch our breath in between, it's those supportive community relationships that exist pre-incident, pre-event, that will allow us together to move from a world of acute to chronic disasters without necessarily having to move from a world of acute to chronic suffering. And so I would suggest to you, all of us, that our main lesson from the pandemic is this: we can adapt. The pandemic did not change the mission of the American Red Cross, but it did change the way we do our mission. We wear masks, we maintain distance, we don't go in homes, but we were there. We're showing up. Thousands and thousands of volunteers in Louisiana, Texas, Michigan, California, Oregon, Washington, South Carolina, North Carolina. I'm rattling off the places that had disasters over and over again in 2020. Even today, we have a large-scale operation going on in Kentucky in response to flooding there 3 weeks ago, where we still have nearly 300 people who are displaced from their homes. In fact, from their homes that are among the 1,000 homes those floods destroyed. We also have ongoing operations in Texas supporting unaccompanied children who've come across the southwest border in record numbers. Red Cross folks are there. And so the pandemic has not stopped us from doing our mission. It's just changed the way we've had to do it. And we will gradually change again as we begin re-entry post-pandemic. But you notice I didn't say change back, because we're not going to go back to pre-pandemic protocols. We've learned a lot from the pandemic, and we're going to take those lessons with us into this world of now chronic disasters. Lessons about how to best use our scarce resources, because let's face it, no matter how many volunteers you have, there will always be more disasters. There's always greater need. And so we've learned how to do that, and we've learned how to do it safely in a pandemic or infection environment, which I'm afraid we'll have to face again. And we'll be ready. While the pandemic has challenged us and has resulted in a tragic loss of life, and I have friends and colleagues who currently have parents and loved ones who are sick with COVID and have a high degree of uncertainty. And so I think none of us would ever understate the tragedy that has been the last year. But there has been a silver lining in that tragedy. And that silver lining is that we have continued, and some have thrived. And we have learned that we are ready. and that we can even improve our readiness even more so that we are ready for the challenges, not only that are coming, but that are here now. So as I wrap up and hand you back to the rest of the program for today, I'd like to share just a quick personal story. I was on the phone night before last with colleagues from the Public Health Service who were down in Texas with the nearly 2,000 unaccompanied children who we're jointly caring for. And my colleague, who has a considerable amount of experience with these missions, he's had 9 missions where he's had to lead the response to large numbers of unaccompanied children, both domestically and internationally. And he said to me, I underestimated the power of the Red Cross, the symbol of the Red Cross or the Red Crescent. He said, I've been doing this for a while, but I underestimated the power of that symbol and the people who wear it to bring hope into the lives of people who were otherwise hopeless. He told me that he was on the phone with the parents of some of these kids who came up from El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, Mexico, many of whom had walked 1,000 miles over the course of several months, some who had gone via freight train or had gone from trucks or some combination of modes of transportation after their parents or families made a desperate determination that it was less risky for those kids to travel 1,000 miles by themselves than to remain where they were. And he said to me that as he'd get on the phone with those parents who were very anxious, were very worried about their children, when he would say, the Red Cross is here, Cruz Roja, there was a palpable sense of relief. And he said the same for the children, because they know Cruz Roja from their country, their national society. And when they see that Red Cross, when they see that symbol I have here on my sweater, they recognize it for what it is, a symbol of hope, a symbol that says everyone is welcome, a symbol of neutrality and impartiality. Don't care what your beliefs are. If you're suffering, you're welcome. And he said the children, just a tangible loss of anxiety to be surrounded by people with this icon. So what I would say to you is, let the icon do for you what it did for those worried parents and those harried children. Let it give you hope. Let it be a beacon as we leave this pandemic environment, and this will end. We are at the beginning of the end of this pandemic. And so just keep in mind that whatever comes next, if we're going from acute to chronic, all of the parade of horribles I described to you today, the one enduring stream in all of that is hope. And as leaders and emergency managers, no matter how tough-minded we are, no matter how pragmatic we are, it's absolutely imperative that whatever else we bring our communities, we bring them hope. So thank you for having me today. And I wish all of you a really invigorating conference time today. And I wish you all to be healthy and well. And I hope to see you in person next year. Thank you so much for having me.
Hi, I'm Sylvia Burwell, President of American University, and I want to thank Jessica Adams, the Executive Director of the National Capital Area Chapter for the Red Cross and a proud American University alum, for the invitation to address you all today about the lessons to be learned from COVID-19. As the pandemic is ongoing, we're still learning, but a key takeaway is that pandemic preparedness needs to be treated with the seriousness with which we think about other national security and economic issues. Just as we invest in a strong national defense to protect our nation, We need to think about pandemic preparedness investments in a similar way. That means investing in things like local public health infrastructure and putting in place the systems for collaboration from DC to Dubuque. Another lesson from this pandemic is the importance of high-quality execution and leadership. This starts with a national framework based on prevention, detection, and response, and moves through deploying the tools and resources necessary to fight the pandemic, including basic public health measures, everything from masks to contact tracing, all of which we know work. Part of this execution includes science-based, accessible communications. We must apply these lessons moving forward, and as individuals right now, we must continue to each do our part in fighting COVID-19. The Red Cross plays an incredibly important role in this fight, and we will come out of this challenging time stronger together.
Hello, I'm Mike Jackman, Chief Operating Officer for the Leidos Health Group. I would like to share a few comments about how Leidos adapted to the COVID-19 pandemic. Even before COVID was named COVID-19, our team at Leidos Biomedical Research, which runs the Frederick National Lab, pivoted their work on cancer research over to focus solely on the virus and to work on therapeutics, serology testing, and conducting clinical trials. We also continued the rollout of the new electronic health record for active duty service members and their families, quickly adapting our approach to a hybrid approach which leveraged remote tools. The system is now live in 20 military treatment facilities. For our employees, we shifted to remote work across facilities. We defined phases depending on the pandemic data trends, limiting the occupancy to safe levels, and we expanded childcare benefits to offer 20 days of subsidized in-home childcare. We launched a caregiver forum to share ideas, experiences, tips, suggestions, and we implemented programs for mental health awareness and anti-opioid substance abuse. COVID-19 has taught us many lessons. We must always remain vigilant, adjust to the next normal, leverage technology, and strongly support our number one asset, our employees. Thank you and stay safe.
Hi, this is David Harrington, President and CEO of the Prince George's Chamber of Commerce. If this pandemic has taught us anything, it's how to be resilient. Since the unfortunate beginnings of COVID-19, the Chamber has stepped up to the plate and provided members and others in the business community with much needed technical assistance and financial connection so that our businesses can remain open. These virtual meetings, webinars, and seminars worked to bring vital information so that businesses then can incorporate those in not only surviving the pandemic, but growing their business. The lesson is this: the changes we made must become the norm. These new promising practices have to remain if we are to move forward. If we ever find ourselves in this situation again, the lesson is this: that when we come together, we all can thrive. This is why we congratulate the Red Cross in convening a conversation of not only how we can survive a disaster, but how we can all use these lessons to become even better. So thank you, Red Cross, for your leadership, and the Chamber joins you in making sure that all businesses have the opportunity and all the community have the opportunity to realize their optimum self. So thank you for allowing us to be part of this conversation, and we look forward to even deeper conversations and partnership to help our community rise to the top. Thank you.
At the onset of the pandemic, it was really important for us to activate this space in a way that was meaningful to our community. And so we opened up our largest ballroom, the Beverly Snow Room, to host over 38 drives. We've collected over 1,300 units of blood, and we have worked with over 1,400 donors.
In addition to our work with the American Red Cross, we worked with the Indigenous Environmental Network to fund and distribute thousands of masks to Indigenous communities. Indigenous communities have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic, and as a company, we wanted to pivot everything we were doing to focus on impact.
And so we opened our co-working space up to mutual aid volunteers who were able to create face masks, create face shields, pack groceries for folks who were really just struggling. It's been really important for us to get rooted in what's going on here in DC and give back in the ways that we can.
From our impact efforts, including our work with the American Red Cross, to the other initiatives, as well as our programming, we wanted to focus on what a different world could look like. It was more than just immediate pandemic response. It was also a process of dreaming, envisioning, and advocating for the new world that we wanted to live in.
Good morning. My name is Marianne Tierney, and I am currently the acting deputy administrator at FEMA. And normally, I'm the Region 3 administrator, which is why I was invited to participate in this event. I want to thank you for inviting me to join you today. I'm sure many of you celebrated, like me, the start of 2021 with a big toast, but we also know that each year comes with its own set of emergencies and disasters. This year is no different. Many challenges ahead of us. So before we discuss disaster preparedness for 2021, I want to take a minute to look back on the year that we just finished. So for 2020, it was an unprecedented year on many fronts. If any period could make a case for disaster preparedness, I think 2020 is the year that we make that case. This year started with FEMA's emergency managers and the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico responding to a series of earthquakes. I actually deployed for a period of time in response to those earthquakes as well in January, which seems so long ago after the year that we had. Then we moved on to flooding in the Midwest, tornadoes and windstorms. We traveled to the Southeast. We had hurricanes across the Gulf, a record year, 30 named storms, 13 hurricanes, 6 of which were major hurricanes. We also had significant wildfires across the West, and in particular in California. And of course, we had COVID-19, which if we were about this time last year, we would not have envisioned what we have been dealing with the past 12 months. So I do want to stop for a moment, and I want to thank each of you for everything that you have done this year, whether you are a first responder in the public sector supporting the COVID response, or in the private sector dealing with the economic repercussions or the business continuity repercussions, or a member of the public who has had to endure through COVID-19. I want to thank you for your contributions and your resilience as we have gotten through this together as a nation. In addition to that, one thing I wanted to mention, just to highlight, if that wasn't enough, the significance of 2020, FEMA responded to 227 declared emergencies and major disasters. That is the most we have ever seen in a 1-year period. So now what I want to do is talk a little bit about the pandemic response and adapting to the COVID-19 environment. So even though the deadly COVID-19 pandemic emerged to disrupt all signs of normalcy last March, the experiences we had in 2017 and 2018 managing multiple disasters informed the planning that we did in 2020 to respond. And our education continues as we adapt our processes and procedures to be effective in the pandemic environment. To protect the health and safety of our workforce, most of our emergency managers continue their jobs via telework and other virtual methods as we adjusted to life in the COVID-19 environment. Amid the chaos, we demonstrated the resilience that we needed to set an example for those we serve, and implemented a COVID-19 pandemic hurricane operational guidance document that we could apply to most disasters, whether it was hurricane related or wildfires or floods. And given our unprecedented hurricane season, we put that operational guidance to use significantly last year. FEMA acted as a crucial federal partner during the pandemic response and quickly adapted to administer a lost wages assistance program that provided over $42 billion to struggling families who lost their jobs as a result of the pandemic. We also moved life-saving and life-sustaining personal protective equipment from every corner of the globe to distribute to critical frontline medical workers who needed it most. Our agency awarded the largest and second largest ever public assistance grants totaling $11.5 billion to support the ongoing recovery from the 2017 hurricanes. Those were for Puerto Rico. And we helped build local capacity and capabilities through the innovative Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Grant Program that launched last year and closed this year, that will provide almost $500 million in much needed funding to improve resilience across the nation. In terms of vaccine distribution, which I know is on everybody's mind, many people are, as you know, seeking a return to normalcy and placing hope in the massive COVID-19 vaccination effort. FEMA has expanded our focus from the initial pandemic preparation and response work and now includes establishing community vaccination centers to get more vaccines into the arms of more people faster. FEMA has already obligated more than $3.8 billion to states, tribes, and territories and to Washington, D.C. for community vaccination centers. As the number of states with obligations increase, we will work alongside our federal agency partners like the CDC and the Department of Defense to provide support to critical staffing, supplies, and other shortfalls to assist, augment, and expedite vaccinations across the nation. I will also note that I just returned from New York City for the opening of 2 FEMA community vaccination centers where we are vaccinating about 3,000 people per facility per day. And next week, we'll be launching a site in Philadelphia, as well as in Florida and New York, and that it will be the first week in March. This is an effort that requires collaboration with other federal agencies, state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, and the private sector. Just as the pandemic has reached into all areas of American life, we will have to work together to emerge from the other side of this pandemic. However, vaccines are just the start. It's the beginning of the end. We must work to ensure that vaccinations are distributed equitably and that our messaging meets underserved communities where they are. One thing I want to note is the disproportionate impact that COVID-19 has had on African American and Latino communities across the country. Twice as many African Americans have been killed by COVID-19 as compared to whites, and 1.5 as many Latinos have been killed by COVID as compared to whites. So it's very critical that we address the disproportionate impact and ensure that those communities are receiving an equitable amount of vaccine. Occasional surges in cases, resource limitations, and responder fatigue and burnout will occur even if COVID becomes less of a threat and becomes an endemic virus that our society will have to learn to live with. The challenges we face, as many as we've seen in 2020, continue into 2021. Growing diversity means that we will need to adapt our efforts to consider the needs of multilingual communities, along with other cultural factors that may impact our work. Increased population growth in urban areas, with many of these areas located along the Atlantic and Gulf Coast regions of our country, means that more people are living in the path of powerful storm systems. The bottom 90% of Americans hold less than 0.25% of wealth. Wealth inequality means that we must work harder to support struggling and underserved communities when fewer Americans have emergency funds to tide them over in the event of a disaster. One often overlooked change is the graying of our nation. According to the Census Bureau, more than 1 in 5 Americans, roughly 73 million people, will be over the age of 65 by 2030. As aging baby boomers transform our senior population and bring new public policy and service needs. The 65 plus group is estimated to grow to nearly 1 in 4 Americans, almost 95 million by 2060. The effort to combat climate change will inform our resilience work as we prepare communities for the challenges that come with shifting weather patterns. We just saw an example of our aging infrastructure with the electrical grid failures in Texas, which highlights not only the Lone Star State's issues, but those of an electric grid that relies on transmission and distribution lines built in the 1950s and 60s. Aging infrastructure is an issue nationwide. The nation's infrastructure is continually rated almost at a failing level by the American Society of Civil Engineers. So some of the things that we need to think about with all of these challenges up against us is how to be successful in this dynamic, changing world. And our emergency management operations must be forward-looking to meet the challenges ahead. And our hope is that you will be a part of those of working towards those solutions. All of us have a responsibility to examine our environments for threats and hazards as early as possible. We need to be analyzing information and historical trends in our communities to understand the possible scope of future threats. We need to use this data and information to determine, develop, and implement courses of action that we need to take. And we can't forget to plan for periods of transition and to long-term recovery. We all know the best time to prepare for our challenges was yesterday. The next best time is today. So I want to cover some pitfalls that you may want to consider when you're preparing for emergencies and thinking about how to respond. In disaster preparations, planning across cities, counties, states, and regions will improve communication channels, especially when overlapping and competing authorities are on the scene of an emergency. Be sure to focus on things that can affect the outcomes of emergencies and disaster situations. Even though it may seem contradictory, plan, but leave room to be flexible and innovative when the situation requires it. While you make plans, also remember all the little things that can eat your lunch, like the last mile of logistics, continuity of operations or business continuity, the administrative management aspects of public sector management, like keeping good records and accounting for your expenses. I also want to mention the importance of restarting community lifelines and services and the complexity of long-term recovery. The challenges we face are many as we move forward into the future through the third decade of the 21st century. Growing diversity means that we will need to adapt our efforts to consider the needs of, as I mentioned, the multilingual communities and cultural factors. The increased population growth in urban areas is also a cause for concern, especially when those urban areas are located in high-risk settings like along the coast. It may be a well-worn cliche, but there are some truth about disaster preparation challenges within this saying. This is a marathon, not a sprint. And as a runner, I can certainly attest to that. FEMA's core values of compassion, fairness, integrity, and respect can be a North Star for anyone who works in our field. We know that the work we do doesn't begin when disasters strike or end when the news stories about them have left the front page. It takes planning to build resilience and prepare communities for disasters that are likely to happen and those that may be coming in the future. And it takes tenacity to meet the needs of those who are facing some of their worst days in their lives when disaster events become personal tragedies. And it takes endurance to get businesses, people, and communities through these events to help them recover and rebuild whatever is lost. I want to thank you for being a part of the community of emergency managers, responders, and a part of the workforce that helps our nation plan, prepare, and recover from disasters. So with that, I want to thank you again for allowing me to participate today. And I hope you have a great rest of your Preparedness Summit.
Hi, I'm Maggie Carter, Global Head of Social Impact for Amazon Web Services. At AWS, we're proud to support the Red Cross's third annual Disaster Preparedness Summit. Being proactive and thinking ahead is critical to standing up an effective response. At AWS, we're committed to working alongside our customers to prepare for a range of disasters. We're also active in helping customers and communities respond and recover when a disaster does strike. Collaboration and information sharing across organizations is key to ensure we're learning from each other and improving our response to the next crisis. We've seen a lot of innovation and new best practices forged during the pandemic, and there's a lot that we can apply to inform future preparedness plans. We look forward to tuning into the summit, and thank you for joining us today.
Good morning. Thank you so much for the privilege of being here and speaking to all of you at this important event, the third annual Disaster Preparedness Summit hosted by the Red Cross. I have learned so much in the last year, as I know we all have, about how we can better prepare for the next health crisis. And it's an inevitability, I'm sure. After all, we've dealt with 4 epidemics of pandemic potential just in the last decade. So we have to be ready, and we have to take key learnings from the last year and play it forward and really bolster our response in the near term, but our preparedness in the medium to long term. You know, I've experienced this pandemic as a clinician, as an intensive care physician, both in the Air Force and as a civilian ICU doc. I've also had response roles at Amazon as their COVID-19 CMO, and then finally as a public commentator in media, trying to make real a lot of what we're seeing, both on the science side and clinically for the layperson. And what I've noticed is that there's a few trends that are popping up that I wanted to talk about this morning. The first is any response, any improved response to the next health crisis will require that we innovate and think big about personal protective equipment. And not just for frontline essential workers. We know what works there. We know we can mass produce, for example, N95s. But the critical capability that we're lacking is that analogous type of high quality, well-fitting, comfortable mask for the masses. You know, right now there's shifting guidance every few weeks from the CDC, trying to keep up with evolving data about what is and is not effective. And the truth here is that we just don't have a good solution. We're telling people to double mask. And when I do this on national media, I tell people to double mask. You know, sometimes I get a receptive audience, but sometimes people are exhausted because it feels like the guidance is changing. And some people just don't want to double mask because it's not comfortable in their opinion. We have to think big about how do we create a well-fitting, high quality mask that's comfortable so that people want to wear it or are comfortable wearing it over the course of a day, ideally reusable. But we don't actually have that capability right now. We're jerry-rigging a few different capabilities and trying to do our best in the near term. But we need to think big here because the next pandemic, the next health crisis that is going to disturb the world will assuredly be a respiratory pandemic, because those are the ones that can spread quickly across borders in less than 24 hours, as we've just seen with COVID-19. But then there's also these episodic disasters like wildfires here on the West Coast, for example, that make it very, very difficult to actually go outside and breathe clean air for months on end in some cases. And this is an annual occurrence in a large part of the United States, certainly in other parts of the world as well. And again, we don't have that face covering, that PPE for the masses that we need to keep people safe and healthy. So this is going to be a key area for us to innovate in. And I really do believe the Red Cross can be both a convener and a facilitator of solutions to this end across both the public and private sector. The second is testing. You know, along the lines of thinking big, how do we arm people with tests at home? In my Amazon role, we've helped to stand up. My colleagues on the disaster response team have actually been leading an effort called the Diagnostic Development Initiative, which is housed at Amazon Web Services. And it's an effort on the part of Amazon to actually help scale innovation in rapid point of care technology across a range of different categories, anticipating that this is not going to be the last respiratory pandemic that we contend with. But the rub here is that we can create a rapid point of care testing platform, but how do we actually embed it to the end user at home? You know, people want to experience these tests in a convenient place at home, ideally. They want to purchase these over the counter and be told how to use them, be empowered with that knowledge, and then effectively use them on their own, purchase them when they need to. For example, when they get on a plane or when they're going to go and see family. They want to be able to access these needed services cheaply and on demand and know how to do them without needing clinical oversight. We're nearly there. We are nearly there. In my role at Amazon, I don't have any financial interest in any of these companies, but I'll show you one in particular. This is a company called Loom, who has essentially innovated in this space in a really clever way. And what they've done here is they've made a COVID-19 test that connects via Bluetooth to a smartphone just through this detector. And all you have to do is you sample yourself with a tester, this dropper here, test into a nose swab, and then there's liquid in this dropper. It intermixes with that nose swab. The sample gets combined, and then you just drop fluid into this detector here using this dropper mechanism, and then 15 minutes later, a result gets finalized to your smartphone. Yeah, the end user is guided through this experience via an app on their phone as well. And so, of course, there's issues of equity. You need to have a smartphone, broadband internet connection, something to that effect to actually be able to utilize these tests effectively. But what we're unlocking the solution to here when it comes to how do we surveil and test for a respiratory pandemic that's affecting everybody, the key solution there is actually having users do it themselves. People do it themselves, but arming them with information. So we need to revolutionize public health education. It's not just about what you eat and how much you exercise, but it's about how do you test yourself using these innovative mechanisms. We need to allow people to feel empowered to do basic medical type services for themselves, like diagnostic testing. And that's the wave of the future. That's what the FDA currently is wrestling with. And in the setting of a disaster, it certainly is going to help the Red Cross and other stakeholders help respond to the next health crisis if people know what they're doing when it comes to utilizing these tests. I'll say in my military role, and this is point 3 that I want to talk about. In my military role as an ICU doc, I'm stationed at Joint Base Lewis McChord with the 446th Aeromedical Staging Squadron, and I help lead our critical care air transport capability. So basically, we can transport critically ill patients in C-17s worldwide from point of injury or point of illness back to a level 3, level 4 hospital. What I've noticed is we do a lot of training, taxpayer-funded training, but we don't ever really interact with our colleagues on the public health side or in public hospitals on the civilian side that might just be down the road, who we will need to interact with in the setting of a disaster, for example. We don't really interact with departments of public health in general on the military side in a preparatory sense. And so this lack of tabletop exercises, bringing the best of the military with the best of our public health systems with the private sector, for example, how do we actually do more dedicated strategic tabletop exercises so that if we do need a whole of society response to the next pandemic, we're not exchanging business cards, as I know folks in the audience like to say, especially since this is a disaster-focused discussion, we're not exchanging business cards at the site of the disaster. We know each other. We know what each function, what each capability can bring to that specific scenario, to that specific crisis. We need more of these tabletop exercises, and we need to start planning that now. I'll lastly say, rewinding back into my Amazon role, one thing that I believe we've done really effectively is work with partners across society, whether it's in nonprofits, across academia, and with departments of public health to scale important initiatives like testing. We're good at middle and last mile healthcare delivery, and we've operationalized that logistical muscle to put things to put initiatives like scanpublichealth.org, scanpublichealth.org into the public domain. This is an effort to scale home testing for individuals that reside in the Seattle-King County area. And it's a collaborative effort between the Gates Foundation, Amazon, the University of Washington, and the King County Department of Health. And I encourage you to go look at it because I do believe this is a paradigm for the future. How do we bring the best of society, of sectors to, how do we bring those capabilities to solve a problem? Like testing at home, for example, how do we scale that? That's going to require capabilities across society. Well, we've done something similar for school testing. We're actually in the middle of a pilot trying to scale saliva testing for schools, public school districts in a select few zip codes across the country, trying to see what works, what doesn't, so that we can be a part of the broader solution. And of course, as our CEO, Dave Clark, has already noted to the Biden administration, we're thinking about last mile delivery vis-a-vis vaccine delivery. And so there is a role here for more dedicated public-private partnerships that can be overseen, that can be facilitated by the Red Cross. But invariably, we are going to need innovations in PPE, better masking for the masses. We're going to need to think big again on what public health education looks like now in this post-COVID world that we're hopefully entering in shortly. How do we arm people with the information so they can do basic things like testing at home and be comfortable to do so accurately, precisely? I'll also remind everybody that tabletop exercises, bringing the best of the military, of our public health infrastructure, and certainly of the private sector to actually mock out scenarios to figure out how we could all interact and work as efficiently as possible together when the next health crisis comes. I feel like there's a lot of improvement there that could be had in that specific category, that specific policy initiative. And then lastly, public-private partnerships, like I've talked about. Amazon has been at the crux of several initiatives focused on scaling testing to individuals either in a specific zip code or for public school districts. And certainly with vaccine delivery, we're well on our way. These are areas that the Red Cross can play a vital role in scaling and helping to facilitate improvement in. And I look forward to being a part of that discussion. Thank you again for having me. It's been an honor, and I look forward to working with all of you in the future.
My name is Leon Andrews. I'm the Director for Race, Equity, and Leadership here at the National League of Cities in Washington, D.C. With more than 30 million cases and over 500,000 deaths, the coronavirus pandemic continues to impact every state, every city, every community across this country. The data consistently shows this pandemic is disproportionately impacting communities of color, in particular the Black, Latin, Hispanic, and Indigenous communities. Even before the coronavirus, we knew that race was still the strongest predictor of one's success in this country. From infant mortality to life expectancy, you just have to look at the data. COVID-19 is the virus, but systems failure is the crisis. And local leaders, mayors, and council members are calling this out, requesting data and making data-informed decisions in this moment. The legacy of institutional and structural racism is playing out in front of our eyes in the midst of these pandemics. The National League of Cities, we are committed to helping local leaders respond with empathy and effectively during times of crisis and beyond. City leaders have an opportunity with COVID-19 and the uprisings to change business as usual and embed racial equity into how they assess needs and allocate resources. In doing, they can rebuild communities that center the vulnerable and those who are disproportionately impacted. Thank you.
Good day, and my name is John Green, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Operations and Resources at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response. Thank you for the opportunity to address the third annual Disaster Summit, the theme of which is how do we learn from the COVID response as we prepare for disasters responses in the future. Now, as we record this, we've been in the COVID pandemic response for well over a year. And that started for us here at ASPR in dealing with understanding the outbreak in Wuhan, the evacuation and repatriation of American citizens from China, as well as the evacuation and isolation of passengers from cruise ships. And then it evolved in working with our state and local partners into addressing surge capacity issues and providing medical care in health hospitals across the country. And more recently, it's been in helping to augment and support the mass vaccination effort of Americans to ensure that we get shots in arms quickly. Now, through all of this, we have learned many, many lessons. Primarily, the fact that our disaster response systems was based around more geographically centered types of disasters, typically hurricanes, wildfires, tornadoes. Here we're dealing with disaster response that's the entire country, the entire world. All 56 territories and states have disaster declarations. The system's not quite designed to handle that as effectively as it could. So a lot of the lessons that we've learned from COVID will be at how to address our response capabilities for these type of more global response requirements. And it's not just in our disaster medical assistance teams and our DMORT capabilities, but also how do we enhance the Medical Reserve Corps, the Hospital Preparedness Program, and all of the programs and how they work together across government and the private sector to ensure that we have a health, medical, and public health system to respond to the next emergency. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jay Butler, Deputy Director for Infectious Diseases at the CDC. Like other workplaces, CDC has made significant adjustments to operations due to the COVID-19 pandemic. For example, in March of last year, we had to shift primarily to teleworking. This was significant for us who were in the Emergency Operations Center working on the COVID-19 response. Like many of you, CDC continues to maximize telework and allow campus access only for those with specific roles in the response or who perform other essential functions, such as our laboratory scientists. We follow our own guidance for businesses and employers, wearing masks, maintaining physical distance. We've also begun vaccinating our workforce following the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices recommendations. Finally, if you haven't already, I encourage you to visit our website, cdc.gov, for updated guidance.
Hi, I'm Telly Tucker, Director of Arlington Economic Development. We're so proud to partner with the American Red Cross at the Disaster Preparedness Summit. If there's one lesson that this past year has taught us, it's that it's essential to be prepared. Our nation has experienced disasters on many levels, and Arlington's no exception. We've learned that the businesses most affected by the pandemic were our small businesses and our hospitality sector. BizLaunch, AED's Small Business and Entrepreneurial Assistance Network, provided technical assistance to businesses to gain access to disaster relief and coordinated training sessions to help them prepare for future disasters. Arlington administered $2.8 million in grants to our small businesses to help pay rent, payroll, and other operating expenses. We also saw many businesses re-engineer their models to adapt to the changing business climate. COVID-19 helped prepare us for the next disaster. BizLaunch can help you get the tools and resources you need to be prepared. So contact our staff for a one-on-one consultation or other services, and your business will be disaster ready for the future. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed our main stage opening speakers. After our break, tracks 1 and 2 will begin. Track 1 is adapting business during a crisis. During this track, industry leaders will address how they continued to operate their organizations and businesses in the midst of a pandemic while keeping their employees safe, informed, and aware of the changing landscape. There are 2 sessions in this track, Changing Business Model and Workforce Adaptation. Attendees who choose this track will hear about the steps business leaders took to acclimate their business model and what they learned to apply to their operations for future disasters. Our track 2 is about tactical crisis management. COVID-19 continues to apply an enormous amount of pressure to our health services like we've never seen before. Many everyday citizens have been left to worry about their own health and how to personally deal with a crisis like this. During this session, you'll hear from local leaders from offices of emergency management on lessons learned from operating during a long-term crisis and how they will implement what they've learned for future disasters. Attendees will also hear from first responders on their takeaways from the pandemic. There are 2 sessions in this track, operations and first responder advice for citizens. Now, before you refresh your coffee or take a stretch, enjoy this short video from Chief Meteorologist Bill Kelly.
Hey there, everybody. I'm Bill Kelly. I'm the Chief Meteorologist here at ABC7 in Washington, D.C. You know, the weather emergencies, they're not going anywhere. Whether it is the fires that we had out west, the record-breaking tropical season, the recent winter spell that we had, these emergencies are going to continue. And so it's very important for you to have a plan for if and when these occur. So what can you do? Well, first start by building a kit. Certain items that you can have in a kit would be things like water, food with a can opener, flashlights, extra batteries, first aid kit with your medications in there. You want to think about your sanitation and hygiene items you may want to have in that kit, copies of your personal documents, and of course, some extra cash, in addition to some other things that could go in that kit. Once you have it, then make a plan. Where do you live? What disasters are most likely? Plan for some of those. And then you got to discuss the situation where you might shelter in place, or if you need to evacuate, because these are going to be different things. Who has what responsibility in your household? And of course, don't forget your pets. What are you going to do with them if you have to evacuate or shelter in place? Make sure you have something for them. Once you have that plan, practice that plan with your family. Know what's going to happen before it happens, and of course, stay weather aware. Know what events are going to be heading your way, and if and when you may need to put that plan into place. You will feel much better if you have that kit and you have that plan. You'll keep you and your family safe, and you will be prepared. These tips and much more at redcross.org.